Some of the best Christmas pictures are little children with Santa. The kids are all dressed up. Frequently, families have stood in line for their turn, only to have the child cry or scream or otherwise display terror. Now, it's easy to understand from a kid's point of view, especially the really young ones, because the situation is quite strange. And let's face it, Santa himself is not exactly normal looking. Being handed over to a fat bearded guy in red could be just a little bit threatening. But children aren't the only ones afraid at Christmas time. Will it be good enough? Can I afford it? Will everybody behave? Do I have to do the same old things? Not to mention the extra fears that surround 2020. Some are actually celebrating a longer season this year with lights and a tree and decorations going up so much earlier than normal. For the weeks between now and Christmas, I'm going to approach the season with a weekly emphasis on a particular emotion. Today we'll start by looking at fear, and in subsequent weeks, joy, anger, and peace. Now, for each emotion, I want to bring out some Bible examples, and certainly the number of the participants in Jesus' birth experience form some kind of fear. Look first at the shepherds, the guys who were keeping their sheep out in the fields the night that Jesus was born. The angel of the Lord shows up, and as it says in Luke chapter 2, verse 9, they were terrified. Can you blame them? Put yourself in their shoes. It starts out as just a plain ordinary night and turns out to be nothing like ordinary. Luke chapter 2, verse 10. But the angel said to them, "Do not be afraid. I bring you good news of great joy." It sounds to me like they were literally overwhelmed. And we can be overwhelmed. We can feel like God is dumping so much into our lap, so much more than we can really deal with. And it happens so suddenly. And while it can be exciting and powerful, it can also feel like it's just way too much. But we don't have to be overwhelmed. And we don't have to be afraid. Because as the angel said to the shepherds, this is something good. Something to celebrate. Remember when Jesus healed the demon-possessed man in the region of the Gerasenes, the guy who lived in the cemetery? What did the people say when Jesus healed the demonic? Well, they asked him to go away. In Luke chapter 8, verses 36 through 37, those who had seen it told the people how the demon-possessed man had been cured. Then all the people of the region of the Gerasenes asked Jesus to leave them because they were overcome with fear. So he got into a boat and left. Sometimes when God works, especially when he works in dramatic ways, it can be literally frightening to us. We don't understand. We don't get it. We can't fully comprehend exactly what's happened. And so our desire is, don't frighten or scare me any further. Like the children of Israel at the Red Sea. There was no way out but through. How many of those folks do you think would have gone through that wall of water had it not been for the Egyptian army of Pharaoh that was pursuing them? They almost didn't have any other kind of choice. But so often when God does dramatic things in our lives, we do have choices about how we're going to respond to that. And it's easy sometimes for us to just say, oh, that's too much. I got to step away. Of course, another participant, obvious participant, is Mary. Early in Luke chapter 1, we're told that Mary is afraid of the angel that appears to her. And yet I think the fear that she experiences is a little bit different. We look at Luke chapter 1, starting in verse 28. The angel went to her and said, "Greetings, You who are highly favored, the Lord is with you. The next verse, verse 29. Mary was greatly troubled at his words and wondered what kind of greeting this might be. And then in verse 30, but the angel of the Lord said to her, do not be afraid, Mary. I think Mary was probably frightened by the context and the circumstances. She really is scared of the words that the angel is sharing. His message is, God has a special plan. And Mary is frightened not only by the moment or not only by talking to an angel, but it's not like this conversation is just going to end and everything's going to go back to being the same. Her life is being unalterably changed. All of her plans are being put aside. She's bound to have wondered, can I handle this? We do the same thing. God says, I've chosen you. And like Moses, we say, who, me? Then you must have chosen the wrong person. Mary could likely see some of the near future, and likely she could have immediately begun to understand how that many of the things she had dreamed were not going to be the way she had dreamed them. Instead, she would need faith to conquer her fear. And she had that faith. And she was able to do what God had in mind for her to do. Now, what about Joseph? Matthew chapter 1, verses 18 and 19. Joseph has learned that Mary is expecting. His betrothed is going to have a baby. Now, they weren't just engaged, they were betrothed. And that meant they had a marriage contract. And now everything is going to be different. All the plans have changed. Joseph still loves her, although he knows at that point that he's not going to be able to marry her, and likely his heart is broken. But because he cares about her, he doesn't want to hurt her. And so he decides to act quietly. But in the midst of that thought process, an angel appears. And in Matthew chapter 1, verse 20, the angel says to him, do not be afraid to take Mary home as your wife. This is a miraculous intervention. She hasn't done anything wrong. So don't be afraid to go forward. God will handle the consequences. Now, the consequences were extreme. We don't know all of them. But the ones we know, in a very short period of time, Mary and Joseph are going to go off to Nazareth for the census. And they're not going to come back to Nazareth for years because of the sojourn that this young family takes into Egypt. For Joseph, it doesn't appear to be a fear of the angel as much as the fear of the complications of his choice. There will be complications. But God would make a way. And Joseph goes forward based on his confidence in that reality. Now, there are plenty of things that can make us afraid at holiday time. The song says, it's the most wonderful time of the year. Not for everybody. For many people, they have serious complications in their lives that cause them to be very fearful as they go forward. Charlie Brown in his Christmas fear says, I know I should be happy, but I'm not. What are we afraid about? Well, that we can't do enough, that we won't do the right things, that we won't fulfill expectations, that the folks won't get along, that this image that we have won't come to fruition. And it's not just about the presents. It's not just about the dinner. I think so much of it is rooted in the fact that we have people that we care about and we want to make them happy. We want to help them to achieve the things that they're feeling inside. And so much of that gets complicated by what we're trying to do. Sometimes we're afraid to ask. We're afraid to risk. We're afraid to say. And we need to never forget that God is there for our fears. Romans chapter 8, verse 15. For you did not receive a spirit that makes you a slave again to fear, but you received the spirit of sonship, and by him we cry, Abba, Father. You don't have to be afraid. No matter what comes, God has taken care of it. If you go through the Gospels, how many times did Jesus say to his disciples, do not be afraid? The antidote of fear is... Now, the secular world would fill in the blank there by saying the antidote of fear is courage. And in many ways, that's true. But those of us who are believers understand that we have courage because we have faith. That God provides the strength that creates the courage. Mary could have passed. Joseph as well. The shepherds could have stayed in their fields, afraid to face an encounter with the Messiah. One of the most interesting passages that you'll come across is in Matthew chapter 28, where it says simply, so the women hurried away from the tomb of Jesus, afraid yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples. Afraid yet filled with joy. It's possible to experience both. Next week, we're going to focus on joy. Oh, little town of Bethlehem. And that line from the song, the hopes and fears of all the years are met in thee tonight. I want to share with you as a conclusion this morning a story that begins in fear. The story is purported to be the truth, and it happened during the 1960s. The famous and beautiful old church had seen better days. In the past, many had filled the pews, but with the decline of the neighborhood, there were few who attended services. A young minister and his wife now served the church, and they had very special plans for a Christmas service. But their plans were changed when a storm damaged the church and created a large hole above the pulpit area. The minister and his wife were disheartened, and Christmas was only 2 days away. They attended an auction held as a fundraiser for a youth group and found a gorgeous old gold and ivory tablecloth. The tablecloth was 15 feet long and only cost the young couple $6.50. The tablecloth covered the hole completely, and in truth, it actually made the church even more beautiful. On Christmas Eve, a middle-aged woman came into the church. She explained that she was waiting for a bus. She had just come from a job interview to be a nanny, but the family had turned her down. She asked if she could pass the time praying in the auditorium. When she entered the auditorium, she was immediately drawn to the gold and ivory cloth. She took a fold of the cloth and rubbed it between her fingers. "It is mine," she said. "It is my banquet cloth." She lifted up a corner and showed the surprised minister that there were initials monogrammed on it. "My husband had the cloth made especially for me in Brussels. There could not be another like it." For the next few minutes, the woman and the minister talked excitedly together. She explained that she was Viennese, that she and her husband had opposed the Nazis and decided to leave the country. They were advised to go separately, and her husband put her on a train for Switzerland. They planned that he would join her as soon as he could arrange to ship their household goods across the border. She never saw him again. Later, she learned that he had died in a concentration camp. I've always felt that it was my fault to leave without him, she said. Perhaps these years of wandering have been my punishment. The minister tried to comfort her, urged her to take the cloth with her. She refused. Then she went away. As the church began to fill on Christmas Eve, it was clear that the cloth was going to be a great success. It had been skillfully designed to look its best by candlelight. After the service, the minister stood in the doorway, and many people came to him and told him that the church looked beautiful. One gentle-faced, middle-aged man, he was the local clock and watch repairman, looked rather puzzled. "It is strange," he said in his soft voice. "Many years ago, my wife, God rest her soul, and I owned such a cloth in our home in Vienna. My wife put it on the table, but only when special guests came to dinner." The minister suddenly became very excited. He told the jeweler about the woman who had been at the church earlier in the day, and the startled jeweler clutched the minister's arm. "Can it be? Does she live?" Together, the two of them got in touch with the family who had interviewed her. Then in the minister's car, they started to the address they were given. And as Christmas Day was born, the man and his wife, who had been separated through saddened Christmases, were reunited. So much fear, so much they had been through, but God made a way. Would you pray with me? Dear God, our Father in heaven, we thank you for the power that you show. Father, there are many times in our lives when we are invited to descend into fear. We know that Satan wants fear to encompass our lives. He wants us to be bound by fear. We pray that we might have the confidence, that we might have the faith in incidents large and small to move ahead, to move forward, to trust you, to not only remove the fear, but to empower us for the task that you've given. We pray this through your precious